You are listening to the ClassofHC Election Clapback series. I am Day G, the host of the Class of Hope and Change podcast. You can find out more about us on ClassofHC.com, and we're also at ClassofHC on all the major social media outlets. So I just finished reading probably one of the best books, most useful books anyway, that I've read all year. It's called Economix, Economix at the end, by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. Came out back in 2011, actually, and I have the link in the description so you guys can check it out if you want to. As a disclaimer, I don't know the authors. I'm not getting paid to talk about this book, but given the foolishness that has been this election season, after reading this book, I really felt like there were a lot of issues that so many of us didn't even understand, and we are easily going to spend the next 2 months having not talked about anything that could help my life or yours. And so I felt like this book had a lot of good topics in it, and so I just wanted to kind of bring the large discussion to the country and see if we could have a different conversation aside from the one that's being presented to us in most of the media. So the book came out back in 2011, and the idea was pretty straightforward. They tried to explain history of the American economy in comic book form, and they actually pulled it off. It's a really, really impressive job. I learned more from this black and white comic book than I did from multiple econ classes in college, and definitely more than I've learned in listening and watching news, most of the news that appears on our television screens each and every single day for the past year and a half or so. So that's why we're calling this series Election Clapback. Really, because I can't personally, at least, spend any more time with kind of the daily silliness that goes on. We really have a lot of issues in this country, and we only have 2 months left to try to at least understand what's going on, and then at least understand what the solutions and the options are, and have people really be able to think about them without sort of just arguing about the typical day-to-day what someone said or what someone did. So I felt like this book was a really good place to start. I realize a lot of you don't have the time to read, or maybe the desire to read, a 300-page comic book on economics, but it was so well done, and fortunately I did that for you already. So we're just going to cover the high points in like little 10-minute segments, and really hopefully it'll spark some thoughts and really help you to organize and have like useful, productive discussions with people of good sense and goodwill who are trying to actually do something positive and actually move forward. And you'll walk away with more information than definitely you would if you spent 10 minutes watching cable news or even an hour or so. Two topics we're going to talk about in this first segment are capitalism and the free market. So these are terms, and I really am going to just focus on stuff in the book that I felt like are terms that everyone needs to understand, and a lot of people do not. And labels get thrown around, and people use these things, names and words, and people don't actually know what they're talking about. So we're going to fix some of that today if you're in that position. So first thing is capitalism. The book talks about this in great detail. I'm just covering the major points. So capitalism refers to things that you use to provide a product or service that you're going to sell, basically. So capital could be anything like land, tools, knowledge, equipment, labor, and or money. And so the idea is you acquire or purchase or borrow money to get some of these things that are capital, again, depending on what you're providing, land, tools, whatever, money, and then you create a product or a service that hopefully you can sell for more than it cost you to produce it, right? That's sort of like the fundamental idea of capitalism. And so if that seemed pretty obvious to you and seemed like common sense, good, because that's how America runs. That is the way money gets moved in this country. And so the first election clapback question for you and your community really is, how does capitalism work for you where you live? Does the system of using things to produce a product or service and then selling that service, is that working smoothly where you live? Is that, how's that working out? And if it's not, if it is, great, and maybe the country needs to see something that's working. And if it's not, where do you feel like things are going wrong? Again, we're at ClassofHC, and definitely hit us up. Email is ClassofHC@gmail.com. We're looking to expand the discussion and really build a different kind of community where we can try to come to some ideas and get a sense of what's working in the country and what's not working. The book goes into a lot of detail about what's working well with capitalism. It talks about what's kind of working, and then it also talks about stuff that's completely messed up. So I'm only touching the surface here, and you'll definitely probably learn a lot just from the little gems that we talk about. If you get the book, you'll learn a lot of gems. So they start the story back in the 1600s. Actually, even before I go there, this book tells the story of the American economy by focusing on the people who created it and who ran it and who owned it. You're going to hear a lot about Western Europe. They also talk a lot about Russia. They talk a good bit, rather, about the Middle East, talk about China and India also. But you hear very little about Central and South America, the empires and civilizations and the people of those regions. You hear very little about the people of the Caribbean. You hear very little about the civilizations, empires, and people of the various locations within the continent of Africa as well. And so they only bring those people up when they're discussing something that was done to them or their reaction to something that American policy did or European policy. And so the second clapback question really in this moment, I feel, is can we get to a place, are people at a place now in 2016 where we're willing to understand that many humans have been living on this planet for a long time, a lot longer than a lot of the places that we usually look to, and a lot of civilizations, every civilization has to deal with how to get, food, clothing, shelter, and services to their people. They do it differently. It looks differently. Are there some principles that we can learn from a broader range of humanity? And maybe that might help us answer some of the questions here. So I just leave that on the table for folks to think about. They start the story back in the 1600s. So again, I'm giving you the highlights. You got to read the book if you want the details. So basically in 1600s, you have Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and they're competing to be the best economy and the biggest economy at that time. The economists in France figured out that if the French government made it easier for the businesses that were making stuff to sell it to other countries, and at the same time made it harder for businesses that were from other countries that were trying to sell stuff into France, then French businesses would get the upper hand. And so that's what they did. They helped businesses out, gave them subsidies, which are basically either, it could be tax breaks, it could be help with research, it could be actual money, it could be all sorts of things that make it easier for French businesses who are making things to sell in other countries. So they did that. Then on the other side, other countries that were trying to sell into France, they put taxes on them and made it harder for them, more expensive for them to sell stuff. That strategy worked. They knocked the Netherlands out of the number one spot back in the 1600s. And so in the 1700s, it was basically France and Britain competing for the number one economic spot. Fast forward to 1776. That year might mean something to some of you all. So you have a Scottish economist named Adam Smith. He's kind of a big deal. That's definitely a name you should know if you're going to have any useful conversation about economics in this country. He put out a book called Wealth of Nations. The book Economix, which inspired this entire podcast series. They talk about that in more detail. I'm not touching that, just giving the high level principles, because it's definitely something you need to understand before you get into any discussion about how things should work in this country. This guy, Adam Smith, he gets credit for a few things that we kind of take for granted today. The first one is for documenting this idea of division of labor. So basically we think of it like an assembly line. If you're going to make a car, now machines do it, but the idea that someone or some machine works on a section of the process so that we don't ask one machine to build a car start to finish, but we have different machines working on different parts, and depending on what the process is, it might be different people working on different parts, right? You see it in Chipotle lines or Subway sandwich lines. And so that kind of concept that businesses work more efficiently when people do that, he was kind of the person who, I guess, wrote that down first and got credit for it. The other thing he gets credit for is talking about the fact that he felt like economies work best when people do things when it's in their best interest, and they don't work best when they're being forced to do things, especially by the government. So he felt like the best thing to do was to leave people alone as much as possible and let them kind of figure it out in terms of what needs to be provided for the society and not force them to do things. Ironically, or not ironically, tragically, while he was writing this in 1776, there were a whole bunch of enslaved folks in Europe and the Caribbean and the U.S. being forced to do things that were not in their best interest. Again, I leave that on the table. And one of the questions, election clapback questions, is how do we understand that for those who, sort of think of slavery as something being over, that when we are starting to talk about the very root of the U.S. economy, this tension and these blind spots were already in existence. So that's something we always have to wrestle with. The way Adam Smith saw it, the example they gave in the book is a pretty good one. You go to the store to buy bread. So there are a whole bunch of processes that led to that step. First of all, someone had to grow the wheat. Then someone harvests the wheat, ships the wheat to a factory. That person or people in the factory turn that wheat into flour. Other people turn the flour into bread. Someone else ships the bread to a store. Someone else has a store and decides to sell the bread. So all these people and all these steps, all this stuff that goes into getting bread into your store, No one from the government came every morning and put a gun to these people's heads and said, you must drive a truck full of bread to a store, or you must plant wheat. What Adam Smith argued is that each person kind of got in where they fit in and figured out that, hey, if I do this service, I can get paid, or it'd be in my best interest. It'd help me live the life or make progress in my life. And so it's in my best interest to keep growing this wheat or to keep selling this bread or keep doing whatever. And so the society ends up with all these things getting done, and no one person in a government office was sitting telling people what to do. So that's kind of what people mean when they talk about the free market. Adam Smith said it was like everybody was being guided by an invisible hand, right? So if you hear that phrase, know that's Adam Smith talking. His big idea was that things work best in the economy when the government leaves people alone. And so you hear a lot of people saying this right now in terms of the political climate. They argue about, let the market decide, free markets are the way. So the question to ask, election clapback question for you is there a free market where you live, in the job that you do, in the way that you put food on the table? Is that a free market? Are people being allowed to do things without the government telling them what to do, or without anyone else telling them what to do? And so is it working for you like Adam Smith thought it would work? He had a whole bunch to say about a lot of other stuff, and he was big on competition and felt like if anything in the process went wrong, the government didn't have to step in because someone else would just compete. Like if you were charging too high a price, someone else would charge a lower price, or if you weren't doing your job, someone would come in and do a job better. So he was big on competition, but he also felt like the government had a role. He felt like the government should be involved in doing things like enforcing laws and street cleaning, controlling diseases, protecting workers. He even felt like the government had a role in keeping big banks and businesses in check and kind of watching kind of what they do to make sure that it's not harming the public. The question for you, and this is kind of the last set of election clapback questions in this first episode, do you feel like the government start local always, in your city or town, what kind of stuff should the government be doing? And then what kind of stuff should they leave for people in the businesses to figure out? And so it's very important, at least for me in this moment, that everybody where you live have a clear articulation of what it is you need done in your community and what your sense of what needs to happen in America is. I'm not really interested in applauding for anyone anymore or clapping for anyone else's ideas. There are 300 million of us. We should be able to figure out some things and get at least some clear policies first, or at least be able to understand what the arguments are rather than just kind of watching people on TV and reacting to what they do. So that's kind of what the Election Clapback series is about. We're keeping it short and sweet. Next one, we're going to talk about what is a corporation. So definitely share the link out and let people know what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a whole separate conversation happening in this country. I think we can pull it off. At ClassofHC is the handle if you want to get in touch with us. If you want to send us an email, ClassofHC@gmail.com. Look forward to the conversation. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.